Okay, the clock's ticked over. I'm going to get started because I do not want to be the session that delays everyone, which I probably will be anyway, so. But let's not make it because I didn't start on time. I'll start my timer as well. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to NDC Sydney. My name's William Tulloch. You'll hear me referred to as Bill. I just want to get that out of the way now. It causes confusion. And I'm a principal consultant with Redify. So today, what I want to do is have a look at Blazor. It's going to be a lot of code, not me writing too much, hopefully, and if my snippets have stayed in place, we should be good. But it'll be a slightly opinionated view of Blazor and looking at it through the lens of front-end web development generally. So if you are doing front-end web development, we are primarily using frameworks like Angular, Vue, React, or if you're the only person in the room who uses Polymer, which is me, that's what we're doing. My only time I use C# nowadays when I'm doing web development is when I'm writing the API for the application. I am incredibly frustrated with JavaScript. I find it a constantly irritating language to work with because I keep changing things. You know, who knew you could use arrow functions? I didn't. I do now. But the simple fact is no matter what you're using, whether you're using TypeScript or you've got a framework that's doing all the templating and stuff for you, in the end, it all comes down to one thing, JavaScript. It's the only language that we currently use within the browser. And I don't think anyone's using VB script anymore, so I did once, just so if anyone's wondering about that. And so it essentially means that we have that restriction. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I don't really have an opinion on it. But it does affect maybe people's movement into web development and working with it. So I'm not going to read this out, but Steve Sanderson, who actually created Blazor, made this quote, which, depending on how you read it, is a bit of a battle call. So essentially they're saying that why should we be limited to just JavaScript to work in the browser? And why can't we use other languages? The great thing is that we have now seen the arrival of WebAssembly. Now WebAssembly is it's a standard. It's actually supported in all of the modern browsers and in mobile browsers. And essentially what it does, it provides, if you like, an intermediate language that higher level languages can compile down to. So if you go around the web and look around, you'll see that people have used Go, C++, Unity's been used. And the idea and intent of WebAssembly is to provide near native performance in the browser. I won't try to go into WebAssembly too much. In fact, it hurts my brain every time I read about it, so I'm just going to give you the high-level view. But in essence, what happens in WebAssembly is that you have a file or an interop created which is compiled to a WASM file. That is then pushes into the browser's compiler and generates AST code that's platform-specific and then runs within the browser sandbox. So very much like JavaScript, it's sandboxed within the browser, so there's certain things we can't do, like access files, things like that. And it doesn't kill JavaScript. So if you've been following anyone's blogs, you'll see, oh, Blazor, WebAssembly, death of JavaScript. It's not the case. They still need each other. WebAssembly has to interop with JavaScript. WebAssembly is sandboxed from the browser APIs, so you can't directly access any of those. So that's what that does. So what is Blazor? Blazor is it's essentially an experiment, and we'll cover that in a second, that takes the idea of writing C# and running in the browser. But unlike, say, the C++ examples, it doesn't compile down to WASM. It takes a different approach. Oh, my slides are out of order. Well, let me talk to this one, and I'll just keep going. So Blazor, it's experimental. So the experimental is Microsoft's term for we don't know if we're going to continue with it. So just be aware of that. It's a great get out of jail free card if you need such a thing. The intent is to provide full stack web development with .NET via WebAssembly. though there is now another version that doesn't require WebAssembly, and we will, if we get time, touch on that one. As I said, it will work on all the modern browsers because WebAssembly is supported. It is a SPA framework. So Blazor's been specifically written in the same light as Angular and React. It is not a generic framework for running C#. So it's not like you can write little C# components and chuck them in. It's about creating web applications. The model it uses, and this is where it differs, is that it actually runs on top of Mono WASM. Now, the Mono team have actually created a WASM version of the .NET runtime, much like they do for iOS and Android. And what Blazor does is it actually compiles your Razor views, which we'll go into in a second, any C# files into a DLL, and along with the system assemblies and any other imported packages you have, loads the DLLs into the browser, which is kind of scary, but that's what it does. Mono then actually manages running them with the runtime and handles the Java interop and accessing the browser API. So that's the difference in the model. C# is not compiled down to WASM. It sits on top of another layer. The thing they're looking at with Blazor, the key things they're looking is they essentially want to have a component model. So very much the same again as what we see in our modern SPA frameworks and libraries. It provides routing. I'm not convinced by it yet. Layouts, I'm not going to go into that. That's very much an ASP.NET core kind of thing, but you can use your layouts. It provides dependency injection, JavaScript Interop. Has auto build as long as you're not debugging. So, but then seriously, you're not going to be debugging in this stuff. So that's kind of cool. You can see debugging has got a question mark. That's a really weird area at the moment. And I love saying this is I've pinched this from someone else's slide. Rich IntelliSense and tooling. Kind of true, as long as you don't run ReSharper. So I only discovered at the beginning of this week that ReSharper was screwing up the IntelliSense for Blazor, so I had to switch it off. Tricky stuff. If you want to get started with it, there's a website, blazor.net. You need to install the core SDK. There is a set of .NET CLI templates for Blazor, which you can install, and there's also a Visual Studio extension. Cool. So essentially, Blazor has a number of project options when you spin up, and we'll have a look at that. There's the concept of client only. So this is essentially a static website. This is kind of the cool one I like because it means you can put it into Azure storage as a website and things like that. The next one they have is the ASP.NET Core hosted. So essentially client and server, and then they have bits of code which will then allow your server application to serve the client. Third one is server-side only. This is new in Blazor 0.5. This one's interesting. So what they've done is that rather than relying on WebAssembly, it renders the code on the server and then passes the changes up via SignalR to your client. The origins of that are interesting because when they were developing Blazor, they wanted the capabilities to run it within different contexts. So theoretically, we could run Blazor inside a web worker. It hasn't been done yet, but the idea is, and the design's that. They've taken this idea and used it to push out the SignalR. And the outcome of that is that apparently they are now going to change the name of it to Razor Components. And in 2019, with ASP.NET Core Preview, that will be part of it. So we'll now have this marketing they've got in and changed the name of it. But that's a server-side thing. I'm not a big fan of it. It makes your application lightweight, but where it becomes, I think, problematic, as soon as your internet goes flaky, your page is not going to display. And your JavaScript doesn't run either, which could be a problem. Okay, so essentially for the most of this talk, I'm going to be in Visual Studio. Just as I tweeted this morning, I killed 3/4 of my slides because I just thought this is going to be boring if I do that. So let's jump over. What I want to do is I want to go through some key aspects of it. So we're going to look at what it's required to create a component, and there's 3 options you have. We're going to look at how we use binding and parameters within it. We'll also quickly look at the dependency injection because it's not quite what you think it is. And looking at calling APIs, and we'll just work our way through a whole bunch of stuff. And I'll make snide comments as I go. So we'll see how we go. Okay, so simplest thing is, so one of the key parts of this is that it uses razor views. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't touched ASP.NET Core in terms of doing web development. Well, I've never have, actually. Let's be honest. I've never used it. And I suddenly got into razor views, and I thought, what the hell's that? I hadn't seen the syntax in ages. I just write APIs. It's easier. So I'm learning. I'm getting there. So essentially, we want to find a razor view. You grab it. What am I calling them? Basic component. There won't be a lot of this. Actually, yeah, that'll do. I should actually, I'm going to go through this and then I'm going to take a step back because I've missed a key point. Okay, so we get this lovely bit of squiggly stuff. So that's our basic, that's our razor view. We're done. We all can go home now. No, it doesn't quite work that way. So essentially, if you're not aware of razor views, it provides a means to basically put in HTML and inline C# code. So for example, if I go and click that, no, not twice. So essentially, this is all I do. I do standard HTML, put some stuff in. There are a couple of things in here that aren't going to make sense at the moment. We'll cover those very quickly in a second. And now part of the syntax is this @ symbol. So this is the way we reference anything in C#. But what I really need here is some functions. And that anything that's within those brackets is where we put our C# code. And if I'm telling you stuff you already know, I apologize now. Right. So essentially what we've done is we've set up, we've got some properties. Interestingly enough, if I do this, let's hope this works. I go public, not that one. Yep. It usually complains. It doesn't like your properties to be public. It wants them to be protected or private. Just protected. Okay, good. So you can set up properties. They can be fields. It doesn't matter. I prefer properties. It's just the way I think. And then what you can see here is that essentially with this class, we bind it. We'll discuss binding in a minute to that property. The default word of bind, it gives us two-way binding, and it will bind to the default property on that item. So if it's a text box, it will bind to the value. If it's a checkbox, it binds to that. Select items, that's kind of weird, but it does bind to something that works. So I haven't quite worked that out. And that's it. And that's all we do. We can also bind functions. So to onClick, I can actually bind a function to actually handle the onClick event. There is another way of doing this. The problem with this is that if you need to pass in any kind of parameters, so maybe you want to pass in the object that's in a list, you can't do it that way. So what you would actually do, I'm going to see if I can do this. You actually do, you would write that, you basically write that statement and then your on method click and you'd pass a parameter into that. So that's another way of binding to events. Not my preferred way. And I think this is one of the things I'm finding a little funny is that some of these solutions are messy. They're hard to reason about what you're doing. So basically we can set up a on-click event. Blazor does provide, Blazor, sorry, does provide certain events, UI events that we can bring in. And you'll see what I'm going to be doing in a second. My point, the problem with those is they don't tell us a hell of a lot. Okay, they'll tell us what the event was, like it was a click. It will give us client X and Y, but no IDs. We don't know who triggered the event or anything like that. And that's something we'll get into a bit more. And then essentially, it runs. That's it. So if I save that, and actually, we'll just do this. So let's run the application. So that's the first way. So I can write a razor view and keep the C# within that file. The second way we can do it is that we can have a razor page, a razor view, and we can have a base class it can inherit from. So this works as well. No, I don't want you to restore anything. Would like you to get bigger though, thank you. And now it's loading. And that didn't work. I tell it, I'm missing one key thing. So once we've created our component, we need to go into the pages, and I was lazy. Control-K-U, and add it in. So here's another thing about components. The name you give your file is the name it uses in terms of referencing it as a component within your page. Can everyone see that? Good. So unlike, say, some libraries like Polymer, for example, you have to specify what its component ID is for working in HTML. This will just take your file name and use that. So you'd want to be really careful about your file names. Might be problematic. And that's it. I'll bring up the sample in a second once I've done the other ones. The next one is this. So what I would do here is I've just got my basic razor view, and then I do an inherit. And then that, let's get this out of the way, essentially is the same code we saw before, but it's in a base class. There's really nothing different about what we're doing there. Okay, so that's number 2. Now, depending on how you feel, that's probably a neater way of writing. So if you go in your mind, pretend code behind, it will work. But it does use the inheritance, and that works. Okay, the third version, and this is the one I'm sure everyone would really want to use, is that you can actually just use a straight C# class. It has to inherit from Blazor component explicitly. The razor views do it implicitly. So you can write this. This is really nice. So, but there's a trap. The only way you can actually do this is that you have to override one of the built-in methods called build render tree. Now, what does that generate? Let's have a look. Doo-dee-doo-dee-doo. There we go. Not there. Oh, nick off. Thank you. Do that, do that. So this is really exciting. That's what you'd have to write. Let's get this out of the way. Believe it or not, this is exactly what Blazor generates when you compile it. The build render tree looks like this. So if you're really, really excited about writing code like this, feel free to do it this way. Personally, I reckon this is where hell lies. So try not to do that. An interesting side aspect of that, though, is that you can actually, and you might see here, I've actually got a thing called render fragments. So there's this idea that we can render fragments of HTML into our pages. You can, if you're so inclined, actually generate it dynamically. So, drive mouse. There we go. Put that in. You can do something like that. So the builder is always accessible from within your code. And if you really felt like it, you could actually generate a dynamic fragment. And, so you can make some decisions about how you're going to format it. It's like writing XML. If you ever wrote XML the old days, this is how we did it. There is someone who was working on an F# library that actually tried to get a bit more of a fluent process for doing it, but it's not worth it in this. So that's it. Those are the 3 ways we can create components. Should save them all. Now, let's bring that window up. I'm just going to show you something here. I'll just point this out. I'm just going to caveat myself very quickly. Sometimes build freezes at the moment in this. But essentially, if I go and do a refresh of this, you'll see that the build started. So that actually makes the development experience a little bit better. As I said, as long as you're not debugging. So this, as soon as I refresh the page, it will go and rebuild the application for me. And once it's done, it'll load. And then if we jump into creating component, shoot the presenter, please. Forgot something, create components. Okay. Bring that back up. So, guess what? I have named something wrong. So that was the name of the old version. So if I do this, you'll see now this is part of the IntelliSense you get. It makes it a lovely purple color. So thick and so you know it's actually valid. Save it, run it. What I want to step back to is I haven't actually showed you what happens when we actually set up the file. What are the key components in it? So I will take a step back and cover that. Waiting. Loads. Now I've got my three components. They are literally all of they're exactly the same. The top one's a razor view, responds to something. Doesn't do anything different. And this one had the dynamic content. They all work. So that's it. That's how you build a component. Interesting thing, and because I might skip over this part, is that a component is a page, and a page is a component. If, for example, I wanted to, I think I've done it here already, not here. We'll cover this. That's the routing. If I want to make a component a page, I just have to put the page attribute on and provide a route, and then it becomes a page. So they're one and the same. Any questions? Oh, lovely. So yes?
This might be a silly question, but for those, like that button and that text box is running in WebAssembly, correct? Or no?
It's a good question. No. What it's actually doing, so this is where this sort of black magic. Essentially what it's doing is that it's compiled into that DLL, and Blazor emits it out through Mono, and it interops essentially out to the DOM. Right. Okay. And
it's not really using WebAssembly as such.
No, it is. It's used because Mono sits on WebAssembly. That's the thing, and WebAssembly has to interop into the browser. So yeah, so Mono sits on top of WebAssembly, and your Blazor application sits on top of Mono essentially. Cool. Something I just very quickly. So when we actually originally set up our project, and this is where it's very similar to what we already do if we, working on APIs. It essentially has a startup file. And basically you configure it. This just runs. The key thing is that it points to a class that we want to start with. An app, this piece of string here, just tells it which component to inject our Blazor application in. If we go back and and the other thing you'll have is that in your web root you have an index.html. And what this will do is I have that statement there. So when Blazor starts up, I've put the loading in there, and once it's loaded, it injects into that point there. It also will, by default, has a Blazor WebAssembly.js, so that handles the bringing all the stuff together, and injects a couple of things. Time's going well. Okay, so very quickly, I want to cover binding a bit more because there's some aspects of that are kind of interesting. So when you saw it before, that essentially one-way binding means if I go at property and just put it within side an HTML element, that's one way. I can't do anything. I can bind two ways by using a bind value. Another one we actually have is the concept of parameters. So we can actually place parameters into our components so we can pass values in. And that's another form of binding. We can also bind to specific properties to allow parent-child binding, which is what we're going to do here. So, there we go. Just remember where, see, I've got a note to myself, add additional properties. So, essentially, I just want to walk through what some of these things are. This is what we've already seen. This is just a private property. It's going to hold some data. I've got a property that I want to display. Now, interesting one here, I've used a thing called markup string. So this came in 5.0, 0.50, and essentially it allows you to inject raw HTML, which is really safe, and you should always be very confident about doing something like that because nothing can go wrong, okay? Just thought I should let you know that. The other tag, and you'll see that in a second, the other one we've got here is a parameter tag. Now, what the parameter tag does, saying here's a property I can inject into or set from either within my page or from another control. And if you forget to add it, you'll get confused. The other one I wanted to quickly discuss, we've got the inject. So sidetrack a little bit, dependency injection. Blazor allows for dependency injection. It is no different from what we do in our normal .NET applications. When it spins it up, it actually automatically injects an HTTP client and an implementation of URI helper. And we'll see the HTTP client in a second. And you can add any classes or anything you want into that. If you want to get a property in, so this is interesting. Why have I done it that way? I probably shouldn't have. I can do it this way. So I can do two things. I can set a parameter on a property and it will inject into it. I can also go up here, fingers crossed, and you can add an inject and you say, what was I injecting? I can't remember. Someone remind me. Markdown service. And you could give it dummy. So you assign it to a property and it'll do that automatically. Interesting note, if you are writing base classes for your Razor views instead of doing it inline, you can't inject through the constructor. It throws a hissy fit and tells you it can't do anything. So you have to do what I've done in this piece of code, which I clearly borrowed from somewhere else. You have to decorate a property with the parameter to get anything injected into your base class. Normal C# classes, as you'll see, will actually behave normally and you can inject through the constructor. But you just need to be kind of aware of that. So that's what we've done here. And this one's also interesting. So I'll come back to this because I've put a comment on what the hell is this. But one of the things about binding from parents is that apparently you need to have a action which follows a naming convention of the property changed for it to actually, for the child to receive the change. So we got that. What happens then? We've got a parent. I haven't got any code in this. I've simply got a selected item, that looks right, which is bound to the select box. And here's another version of binding. So we saw before, if I just use bind, it will bind to the standard HTML elements key property. If I'm binding to a child, I go bind selected, so I can actually specify the property I want to bind to. And then that will feed through. So what's going to happen here is that when we run it and I change, or I select an item from the list and it goes to selected item, it will bind to the child selected property. But that's where it needs an action selection change to actually work. And I haven't worked out why it has to do that, but there's probably some magic going on. So I'm just going to build it. This is the best part about coding live, is waiting for the build to build. So, all things being equal, love my optimism. I might want to just refresh that. Okay, so that's the parent. I go in here and I select something from the list, and it doesn't work. Oh, I'm feeling very excited now. So I knew this was going to happen. No, that's got nothing to do with it. So let's try another one. Okay. Got to go and do some doctoring here. So look, bind selected, child, selected item, child. Yep. One key thing. Okay, so one thing I haven't really covered is life cycles on classes. Blazor views or Blazor components expose a number of life cycle elements that you can hook into, which is pretty standard for web. You have concept of on init, so when the thing is initialized. There's also an initialized async, so there's synchronous and asynchronous versions of basically all of these. So for example, if you wanted to make a call out to a web service on initialization, you would use initialization async, and then you can do your await on that. The other ones you have on render, on after render, and on parameter set. So this is a nice one. What on parameter set will do is that when a parameter changes on your application, you can put some code in to do something, which is what the cowboy was missing before. So he goes here. So essentially what I've done, all I've done in this is when the parameter changes on the child component, it will check it, and then it will then look up for the appropriate musician in my secret collection of musicians, and then do a conversion and convert the markdown in there. So save, build. There's a couple of things that this touches on as well. I've used a NuGet package. So another part of what made me interested in this was the ability that we could actually take and use existing NuGet packages, given that they're .NET Standard 2.0, there is a catch, and then incorporate them into my browser. So in this instance, I have there's a NuGet package Markdown dig, which will actually do convert your raw Markdown into HTML. So I've actually brought that in, and that becomes part of my application. And to prove myself, as I said though, the scary part is we're actually downloading all these DLLs. So my application is back up. Fingers crossed. I select, and I get text. Ah, I win. Thank you. That's it. I'm going now. One clap, I'm out. And so, but that's really cool. And this stuff gets. The problem is, part of it feels kind of not quite finished. There's still this sense when you're writing it, you're going, oh, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. And my case in point is the fact, for that to work, has that text got bigger? I think it has. I had to put this weird method in here. What I had to do is put a parameter that can take an action, and it had to have that name. I'm not quite sure what's going on. My feeling is what Blazor's doing is it's hooking into that and saying, I need an action to actually trigger for this to work. If I took that out, it won't work. But I don't know why yet. But you can see what's it doing. And as you can see, it's actually nice and quick. Once we're up and running, it's fine. The NuGet package thing is interesting. So yes, you can actually, and that's the part that excited me, is that the idea that I can use existing libraries. Now, I've done something really weird in here, and I'll show you, because it's really interesting, is I brought in Serialog. Because logging's great, even if it's to the console. So here's something about this, and this is the problem, is that when you're debugging at the moment, console log is the only thing you've got most of the time. And that's console write line. So you can actually use console write line. The console is coming back. It's cool. And Blazor will actually push that out as WASM. But I was thinking, but I want more information. I want to get funky. So literally, I've got Serilog. And if we jump into the startup and go up to here, that one, program file, because that's where I did it. I wrote a Serilog sync, pretty basic, that will write to the browser console. So now I could, and so that means any class I bring in externally, and it's still, if it's using Serilog, it will just keep logging out to the browser. So you can do stuff like that, and that's kind of crazy, foolish, possibly. I don't think I need to demonstrate that. Trust me, it works. This is something else that we should probably touch on, and I think I had it. If I bring up my application, I don't need to rebuild it. Yep, F12. Control 1. So, two things here. So that output at the bottom, everyone can see that, is an output from an event arg into the click method. And as you can see, it gives me some information, but I don't know anything about what triggered it. The other thing is, I had to serialize it into JSON. So here's the thing: the communication between WebAssembly and the browser, I think it was only used as ints and string, and there's something else. So you can't pass. Normally if I'm writing a normal web application in JavaScript, I can go console log, pass an object, and I get this lovely, little thing I can drill into and find out what properties are. Won't work. All you'd actually do is get the string representation of whatever it is you passed in. So if you want to log via this, you have to serialize it to put it in. And that's another one of those frustrations. Right? If I'm trying to debug something, but if you need it, it's there. And we get out of that. Cool. Oh. So we covered dependency injection. Routing, very quickly. So what actually happens is that if I've decorated anything with the @page attribute, this thing kicks off. They apparently will change it. And what it does, it basically walks your assembly and finds all the things that have got that attribute, and then will manage the routing for it. They come out of the box. They provide, and I will show it to you very quickly. Pages. Nav card. So this is the. They provide a thing called navlink, and essentially that you just need to provide a link to it, and it can be very simple, and it will resolve it, and then it generates an anchor out for it. You can also use the URI helper inline code. I've got another example of that where you can actually pass it in again the part of that route you want, and it'll resolve it. The other thing with routes is you can pass parameters. I'll come back to that. It's something I wanted to discuss. So if we looked, where's my example? Interop, don't want that. Let's open that one, more interesting. You can actually, if you look at the top of this, you can actually provide multiple routes for a page. So for example, if you want your root URL, you can do /, but you also, if anyone types in home, it will go to home. You can also do it so if you want to pass a parameter in, you can actually specify it like that. And as long as that parameter is actually, I know why that one's not there. It's actually a base class. You can do that, as long as that parameter's there, it will then add that parameter in. I'm actually going to jump to that example because it should be working. So you can also put constraints on those parameters. There is a limit to it, but if you only want to pass an int, you can actually specify it as an int, and then it will throw a curly and not do anything. So we go back here. Yeah, that one. Get rid of that. This will lead me into looking at the HTTP client. I'm just kind of taking a quick detour. And hoping the internet's working. Ah, there we go. So if anyone thinks I've hacked some API to get to NDC stuff, no, I screen scraped and then pushed it up into Cosmos DB. This is fake. So essentially, as you can see here, here's my route at the top. If we look at that, bring it up, it's just that. Now, to prove this actually works, let's shrink that again. I could do this. I haven't tried this. Thursday. The only one problem I found with if you type the route into the URL, it reloads everything. So believe it or not, that filtered to only Thursdays. So I can pass it the day in as a parameter and then it gets applied. And then you can, much nicer to do it this way, and it loads up. So you can actually use your routing to filter stuff, and you can do it all on the one page. Quickly jump back to that example. Here's another point. As I mentioned, they have a URI helper, which you can inject into your service, into your application. Again, I'm using the on-parameters set async. Now, this time I'm using the async one, so it actually calls out to my service, and depending on whether I've got a day or not, we'll call either get all or filter by get day. Does some magic with this loading. But this one here, navigate to. So you can also, within your code, use the URI helper to actually work out what the route is by passing it the piece you want. So in both cases here, if I haven't got anything to filter, I just want to navigate back to NDC talks. And if I have got a filter, then this is the route I want to do. So again, and I'm still using all standard C# stuff, you know, it's kind of cool. So it's not bad. My issue with routing, and it's a general thing with Blazor and security, is that I can't do things like route guards at the moment. If you work in Angular, you can actually put, you can set up a route and you can actually put a guard on it saying, you know, this should only be available if, you know, your name's Bob. You can't do that. And because it uses attributes, there's really no way to add anything into that because attributes won't take actions, for example. I tried it. And that kind of bothers me a little bit because I would like to be able to lock down particular pages and stuff. We normally do. If we've got a business application, you don't want your general users getting into the administration page because they'll give themselves a pay rise and things like that. And so that part to me is missing at the moment. Similarly, the whole thing around managing logins and authenticating is not brilliant. I do know that someone has written a Blazor JavaScript Interop for AAD, but the problem is it's actually interrupting through JavaScript. So I'm not convinced that that's the way we should go. It would be better if we could have a native C# that could actually handle that properly. So eventually that will come up with, but that's to me is the weakness of the routes at the moment. It's an all or nothing thing. The best I could do is probably put a guard statement at the beginning and then look something up and get that sorted. Okay. I'll very quickly, I'm not going to run the HTTP because the clock is ticking. Where is it? So what they've done, the services. There we go. I'll pick this one here. Not that one. That one actually isn't. So what they've done, this is Blazor uses HTTP client. It's just your bog standard HTTP client. What they've done is they've written an HTTP message handler specifically for Blazor. And what it does is actually interops into Fetch API in the browser. It basically does all the things. They've written some extension methods so you can do the JSON. They've got their own JSON deserializer. The hope is they'll get rid of it eventually. But there were some issues with JSON.NET. And so when we want to call the API, it is no different from what we do in C# normally. And that part I really like. I like the way I don't have to think about it. Though admittedly now we've got Fetch API in JavaScript. It's a lot easier than when it was it XML, Ajax, HTTP, something. There was this horrible song and dance you had to do to call it an API. Okay. The point I've left, which I haven't touched on, is interop. Ooh. So you, at some point, you need to talk to JavaScript. Now, the interesting thing, and I'll bring it up, and I was going to mention it at the end, the problem I had when I first started playing with this is I started thinking like I was working with JavaScript, and that's a trap. I think that if you want to work with Blazor, you've got to step away and start thinking differently. I've seen a lot of examples where people have done things like implemented a Blazor version of Toaster, which is full. I haven't got a problem with that, but it's JavaScript Interop. And any call across that interop is going to take time. It would seem to make more sense to me to write a purely C# Blazor-based Toaster component rather than interact. But because we're so used to using these libraries, npm install, Toaster, and bang, you've got to step away from that mindset. Because the first thing I started doing was writing all these interops. And then I said, this is just chewing up time, and it's weird. There are things we do need interop with. So the entire browser API is critical. If you want to use local storage, you want to use notifications. I started working on implementing IndexedDB and then got bored. Oh, well. So let's actually have a look at what's going on there. So there we go, source. I've cheated a little. I used TypeScript once I worked out how to get it to behave itself. So to call a JavaScript function, you've got to register it in the window. The way that you can do that is essentially you can, where is it? I can actually add it on. So what you normally do is you basically, is the essence of essentially having a namespace. You'll say, give it a name, and then you add your extension methods into it as that. If I looked at the JavaScript for that, yeah. No, we don't want to look at that. I forgot. Webpack. Tricky. So essentially, the JavaScript method's got to be registered with your web application. The two examples I've got here, which are interesting, is one is a canonical alert, which we'll look at in a second, and the other one is using geolocation. So I can then go and write essentially my own class to handle geolocation, provide a method on it, and I can call that. Works with promises. That's really nice. So if you are returning promises, your .NET will respect that. And if we actually looked at the C# code, the trick to doing all of this stuff is the JS runtime current invoke async. It takes a value it expects to return. You have to pass it the name, so essentially the namespace, and what the method is you want to call. You can pass parameters to it. It works fine. Same with this one here. That works. So I go here. So actually, the canonical example is prompt. This is some text, and I can just display alert. I'm going to clear that text and see if this works. It's something the bug you. It doesn't say anything. Refresh that. There is a bug in Mono at the moment. Mono believes the entire world is running on UTC time, which can be confusing if you live in Australia. So just very quickly, if I call date time from within Blazor, it's currently 1 o'clock in the morning. I know you didn't think it was that early, but that's the way it rolls around here. Okay, get that out. Just be aware of that if you're playing with this, because you don't want to depend on it. Hopefully they'll get it fixed. a better version is if I actually, in this one, I'm actually going out and I've essentially called the geolocation API. It's got me the location, and then I've gone and called bin map services to actually work out where I am, which is not where I am, but you know, I didn't check for accuracy. The other thing we can do is we can call .NET from JavaScript, which is interesting. Nick off. So very quickly, I do have that. Okay, so to do that, there's two ways. The first way is that you have a class, you have a static method on it, and you decorate it with the JS invocable attribute, and preferably give a name to that method. What I've done here, because this seemed like a really cool thing to do, is generating a hash. And that's all that code does. To actually call it, I've done this a little differently. Down here. I had to put it in here. To call it, within your JavaScript, you use .NET.invoke method async. You need to know the assembly name, and you need the name of the method, and then you pass it a value. The other way you can do this, and I haven't got a version of this, is you can actually create a .NET instance and pass it into the JavaScript and then call a method on it. But again, you do need to know what that method is, so it's not completely brilliant. But on the off chance you need to call back into this, so this is wired up to that method. If I click it, I get a hash value. I win. Cool. Do you need it? Yes?
Can you get C# to call JavaScript and get JavaScript to call the C#? C# just calls the JavaScript?
Don't laugh. I know that's kind of the stupid stuff I would think of at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I did. I haven't tried it yet. And the reason I was interested in it is I was trying to build a Markdown editor, and what I wanted to do is that as you type the Markdown, the actual Markdown display would update automatically. So you type, bang. The problem is currently the way Blazor works, it doesn't seem to pick up change. So if you hook into the input on your text area, it fires, and Blazor actually recognizes it, but your property doesn't get updated. So you have to wait till it blurs to change it. So what I was thinking is I could write a JavaScript that would hook on to the input on the text area, and then it would call a .NET method to return the value as it changed. So I was actually thinking that. But I don't know whether that's a rabbit hole I particularly want to go down. I'm already down quite a few, and that's probably the last thing I want to do. Okay. We've got 7 minutes. Probably the last thing I just want to touch on very quickly. One of the things, and there's 2 instances in here, up here, you have a concept of a Blazor library. So you can actually create a library and create components and the like in it. Down here, I've actually written a login container. Now this has got some interesting features in it, which I will quickly touch on. One of the things that you would probably want to know is, how do I handle raising events? It's a question I ask myself. You can't go emit event or anything like that. So what you actually do is you have to provide an action parameter on your component that then you can then pass in a function to be called. So in this one here, for example, I've got an action called login details, which will then, if the parent component has an action associated, that will then get an event. So then we can actually look at that whole thing of actually using more of a one-way or omnidirectional flow for our data changes. And I've got one for cancel. I'm going to run this up. This thing has a couple of things which are interesting. It has its own style sheet, and it has its own JavaScript. This is an instance where, for example, because Blazor can't actually directly communicate with that element, but I want to give focus to the first element, I can write I can pass an element into the JavaScript and then get it to focus. And if we looked at what that was, the way we do that is, I want to hook into here. I actually set a ref and I give it a name. And what that will do is that on the property down here where it says element ref, it will hook that in. And then I can pass that element ref into it. The problem with that, the element ref is opaque to Blazor. You can't do anything with it within Blazor. It only makes sense when we pass it through the JavaScript. Okay. Because there's a couple of things we want to do that. And that's the login control. Now, here's some things. When you create a component library, and you put any CSS in or JavaScript, it gets embedded as a resource. This is very exciting. And if I bring up F12, oh, yes, thanks, we don't want to see that, elements. And I'll dig into this, into the header, and I'll zoom it in. If you look down the bottom 3 script inserts, I think it's the bottom 3. What you ignore the top one. That's my other one for the Serilog link. What you actually see is that it actually automatically drops those script references into your app. There is an interesting problem with that, and especially around CSS, that if you create a CSS in a component, you cannot override it. There's nothing I can do to change. I've tried variables, I've tried everything. You can't change it. So you're going to get stuck with it. The only way you can do it is, and because you can't, you write a component and you have to put on a property that can say managed class, or property that you can inject styles into. Seems like a lot of work in my opinion. So that's kind of really interesting if we cancel that and show login. But as you can see, I've got the focus on the first text box. That was the element change, and I really don't need a password, but I will anyway. Okay, bang. Very quickly, because we're running out of time. The other aspect to that is that you can also grab a reference to your component, and if you've got public properties on it, you can actually call them. So if I went into, bang. You know I've lost the page. That's really scary. There we go, logging an example. So similar kind of thing. This is my login control up here. I can grab a ref for it, and I've got login dialog box. And what I can actually do is I've got a public method on it called show. So it's meant to be show and hide it. It's a modal dialog. I can then call that method on that reference. Cool. That's it. We've got 3 minutes left. And am I going to push it to the nth degree? We've discussed server-side only. So where do we stand? I was really dubious about this when I started working with it. There was, I literally had a cognitive clash between, I've worked in Angular, I've worked in Polymer, and you know, I kind of got that in my head, it works. And then I started writing this. Now, it could have been that the whole razor syntax is a little freaky, and it was. The more I've done it, the more I'm thinking, this actually could be feasible. Where I think they've got weaknesses are around things like, we don't, you know, it's not like a web component. There isn't a shadow DOM. I can't hide my style sheets. Those things are kind of weaknesses to me. You can actually inject style directly into your component. I didn't find out what it did, but it will put it into the, because it doesn't care. It just writes that stuff out. They have a concept where I can put child components in, but it has to be at child content. So we don't have things like slots. So if I wanted to make like a card thing and I wanted to be able to inject a title slot and stuff, I can't do that. So you've got to create separate things. I actually found that not having to worry about how Webpack was running and stuff was kind of nice. I just compile and it works. This is good. So it has potential. I suspect though Microsoft are actually going to look at actually being able to compile C# down to WASM at some point. So it's hard to tell where this will go. The roadmap is to release 6 in September. They're doing some monthly updates, and as I mentioned before, the Razor components. There are actually some really good, surprisingly, the community around this is really taking off. So a lot of people have written examples. People have written an interop for the local storage. There's variations on Redux and Flux, so we can implement that model in it. So there's a lot going on. It's reasonably easy to pick up. It just takes a little bit more time to deal with the nuances of it, because it's really about changing your mindset. That's about it. I think we're finished. Are there any questions? And there's a hand at the back.
The end goal of Blazor, is that to try and eliminate the use of JavaScript at all, like the need to use JavaScript?
That was a really popular one. You know, well, you can't, because JavaScript's actually critical to the whole interop process. So the thing with WebAssembly and this is that they live together. I think it's more around the fact that there are still a lot of developers who aren't comfortable writing JavaScript. They're probably ex-Silverlight developers, so they're, you know.
To use JavaScript, what are the main advantages of going towards Blazor?
If you're really, look, I'm going to be frank. I love writing C#. I think in C#. I think a lot better in C# than I do in JavaScript. JavaScript, I still have to use a dictionary to remember a word, and you know, every time I have to use a promise, I get confused. And so to me, it's a more natural language to write in. Some of the other things we didn't really touch on is if you've got a client and server app, and I have basically all my data models as a shared library, I can use them across both. So I'm not having to, normally if we have our API and I've got, you know, say a user model and it's got first name, last name, blah, blah, blah. On the client side, I've got to write a class to handle it, or I've just got to remember what it is and it comes in as a JSON object. What you can do in Blazor is I can have my user class in C# and then basically import it into the client and use it there as well, and makes it a lot easier.
Eliminating some duplicate code between the client and
I think eliminating duplicate code, managing change across those things. I mean, is it a great reason to jump? Not necessarily, but is it more convenient? Could be. Any other questions? No?
When's 1.0?
When it stops being experimental. You know, so it might end up being like one of those planes that crash, those test planes. You know, Steve Sanderson's really dedicated to it. It's open source. There are a lot of people contributing to it. I think once they shake out some of the bugs, and debugging is a big one at the moment. The fact that the debugging experience is utterly awful is a problem, because it, you know, and that I think is a big stopper. I think the other thing is I haven't actually looked at testing yet. I've looked at their code. They use how they're testing components. They're using things like headless browsers and stuff. I haven't looked at that testing experience. I think there's still a few things they need to do. I find the fact that I can't directly access an element from within Blazor is a little bit iffy, because sometimes you just need to do that. So it's hard to say, but there's a reasonably strong community around it. Anything else? No? Done? Dusted? Sold? Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your time.